And the Americans think that they will use October 7th in order to bring back the two-state solution. They are dreaming. This is a pie in the sky, because Israelis have shifted strongly to the right. And according to one poll, 40% of Israelis say they moved rightward in their opinion. So if the two-state solution was off the table before, it's now completely dead.
There have been a lot of different views about how to respond to October 7th. Perhaps some atheists?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure they are. I think they're just not well represented in the media. I think they're the feelings of most Israelis, and I think there is a huge rift between progressive elites who seem to fear the awakening of the instinct of survival more than they fear the enemy, because they've accustomed themselves to think that the great danger is within, and they've not managed to change their frame of reference. And most of us did. And I think people do not fully appreciate what it all meant, because these sites that we saw on October 7th, they reach through all the layers of modern Jewish history, down to the biology and the geology under it. I think these are the deepest layers of 2,000 years of Jewish helplessness that were supposed to never again happen. And it's not that we thought that being here is necessarily safe. And when we say never again, we don't mean that Jews will not die violent deaths. We're ready for violent deaths. We have an army to be ready for that. And it's not the safest place for Jews around the world. But the core of Zionism, I tried to illustrate this in one piece through the writings of an interview with Ze'ev Sternal, the late Ze'ev Sternal, a historian. I don't think I agreed with Ze'ev Sternal on anything, whatever, and I fought against his views, which I always saw as post-Zionist, because he was against nationalism. For him, nationalism is always the bogeyman. Patriotism is awful. While I think that national solidarity is the basis for what we called mutual guarantee. Is that a phrase in English? Kulanu arevim ze lazeh. We are all responsible for each other's fate. And so I had a lot against Sternal's position, but he had an interview, I think it was the mid 2000s, and he said, I'm a super Zionist. I'm not just a Zionist, I'm a super Zionist. And the interviewer, Ari Shavit in Haaretz, he was kicked out of Haaretz since he's sort of left center, and there's not much room for any of these anymore in Haaretz. Haaretz is it used to be precise to say the New York Times of Israel, but I think it's way more progressive than the New York Times, as if you can imagine that thing. So it's basically Haaretz, I think, is the primary source for anti-Semitic sites around the world. Jeffrey Goldberg had an argument on Twitter with Haaretz people, including Shoken, the publisher. And he said, look, guys, when I get links to Haaretz from so many neo-Nazis, I'm going to take a break, because they portray Israel as this Nazi state. And this is what happened to the Israeli left, basically, is that they've given up on convincing the electorate to go for a two-state solution. So they opted for external pressure. And this is why they set up so many NGOs who are fraudulently using in their mission statements human rights, because they're not dealing with human rights. They're dealing with slander and blood libels against the Jewish state and double standards. That's what they're peddling, which is the exact opposite of human rights, right? Human rights is supposed to be the end for double standards. And they're just peddling anti-Semitism in the guise of caring about human rights, promoting the Palestinian agenda because they believe that if you demonize Israel, you invite enough external pressure so that Israel would do what it doesn't understand it should. This is the leftist position. So the left has believed, and I believed for many years, in the two-state solution. The two-state solution is a very intellectually convenient concept because it seems to square everything together and synthesize it into one coherent, politically, morally, and I'd say in terms of identity, in all these terms, it squares everything together. So if you're a Zionist, you believe in the right of all peoples to self-determination. This is the core of our Declaration of Independence, right? It said, it is the natural right of the Jewish people to be, like all peoples, masters of their own fate in their own sovereign state. The English is very elegant. The Hebrew is amazing. It's Ben Gurion's biblical Hebrew. Omdim birshut atzmam. It's beautiful. So I used to say that I'm a Zionist and I believe in the right of all peoples to self-determination, and I demand my own because I recognize it as being universal, so do the Palestinians. And it also answers the Zionist concern for demography. So you can say we have also egotistic reasons for partitioning into two states, because we want to preserve a state with a Jewish majority, which is the logic of the partition resolution of the UN from 1947, because what was the controversy about? It was about Jewish immigrations. The Arabs were saying that we are going to turn into a minority in this place we see as our own country. And so the UN Commission on Palestine said, we'll partition the land so Jewish immigration can continue into the Jewish part without endangering the Arab majority on the other side. So there's also the egotistic consideration, and it squares with the Arab interests, and it also squares with human rights and democracy. And so it's intellectually beautiful and seductive. As Amos Oz used to say, the Israeli prominent writer, he used to say, the patient is already on the slab, on the operating table. I guess slab is not the right word. It's already, well, it might be. The patient is already on the operating table. We know what the surgery should be. We're just waiting for the leaders who have the courage to perform the cut. And so also the metaphors were beautiful. Problem is, it's a complete fantasy, and it stems from our inability to imagine the otherness of the other. We imagine the Palestinian national movement as we see ourselves, and we know that Zionism was about self-determination, it was about political independence, it was about making the Jews masters of their own fate, and so we believed that the Palestinians are aiming for the same goal, and they are not, and never have. And eliminating the Jewish state is more important to them than their own lives, as you can see in the idea of a suicide bomber and in the behavior of Palestinian leadership. Note that Gaza was never built as a hope. No matter how much aid the international community, for whatever that term means, has been pouring into Gaza, it all went into terror tunnels and weapons. And they never, for a minute, told their population that they're going to take care of their well-being. So I supported the two-state solution, and then too many buses exploded. And we started realizing, wait, where is the Palestinian peace movement? They told us the bombers were the enemies of peace, and they're enemies of peace on two sides. There were Jewish terrorists, there are Arab terrorists. These are the enemies of reconciliation. So we know where our peace movement is. We know where our government is. Where is theirs? Who in that we had to pull out of Yasser Arafat's mouth some vague denunciation of slaughter of innocent Jews, and only when we forced him, we mumbled something in English that his population wouldn't understand. There was no peace movement. So I, with many others, just, it turns out, we understood there's no prospect for peace. And I shifted to unilateral withdrawal. which is less elegant, less coherent, but I thought effective in a cutting the Gordian knot kind of way. And I said, look, I don't want to rule over the Palestinians for two reasons. Human rights, I don't want to violate human rights. And I don't want to lose the Jewish majority. So both of these now lead, this is without the idea of self-determination on the Palestinian side, where you remain with two arguments saying they both lead to unilateral withdrawal. So just let's end the occupation. Let's just get out of there. And the rest will be their problem. And if they shoot at us, we'll shoot back. That was with respect to Judea and Samaria as well, what you call the West Bank. It was just supposed to be in phases. And then we went to the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And there were pieces in the, I'll quote something from Haaretz. It would be the new Singapore. You'll see. Next year, you will go to the Negev to wipe hummus as we do with the bread, to eat hummus on the beautiful beaches of Gaza. You will go to Gaza for shopping, for doing business.
This is what Haaretz says to make sense of the
Yes, yeah, on the eve of unilateral disengagement. In fact, the whole left said it, but there's one preposterous, I mean, retrospect is just, it's just risible when you read it, because it also has this condescending view of Israel. The smart Gazans will see our greediness, and so they will sell us cheap furniture to all these Likudniks. It's like you can see how in their mind, it happens often, they use the Arabs in order to denounce the right in Israel, and especially the non-Ashkenazi, primitive, religious, all the deplorables. So that's for Haaretz. And you see it in Haaretz now. Haaretz consistently, if you read Haaretz every morning, which I never recommend to anyone sane, their line of attack is not against Hamas, it's against Netanyahu. Every single piece, almost. There was, in the first week, all the opinion pieces were against Netanyahu, and one opinion piece by someone who writes for them regularly, I don't know how he made it in, he said, look, I'm reading your op-ed pieces, but what about Hamas? Is Hamas guilty too in these things, or is just, and he said, I agree with your criticism on Netanyahu, but there's also a problem with Hamas, isn't there? So not for them, and they're now pushing for a ceasefire. These are the same people who want, and I can explain this, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it emerges straight from their logic. They are now maneuvering to push Israel to defeat, and that's not just, it's not evil. It's a plan, and it's a rationale from the. And I know this because I come from these circles in the left.
He used to write for
I used to write for us, but I was a counterpoint in Haaretz, so I wanted to see how long they will suffer me, and in the end, they didn't, and it was marvelous the way they fired me, because stupidly, instead of just letting this petter out and start rejecting pieces, they declared that my opinions are illegitimate. These are the opinions of half of Israel. They're not just, it's not just they don't agree with them. These opinions, said Shokin, the publisher, Taub's opinions are illegitimate and should not be heard. So that's like branding yourself as Bolshevik stupidly. And I thought to myself, guys, you know me. I'll be much worse on the outside for you, and I am going to be. I mean, I am. I've been writing against the Haaretz before I started writing for Haaretz, which I figured would be to get a little of the light into this darkness for their readers, because they're a near monopoly on Israel highbrow journalism, and the intelligentsia is almost a captive of Haaretz. So I thought I would get some of the truth in there, and in return for a semi-truce, because I stopped saying Haaretz, I started saying the left-wing press. So they allowed me to, which a few years before that, I wrote scathingly against them, and I said to many people, I said, Haaretz will never let me get a word in. And then one day, the deputy editor of the weekend magazine was sitting in the audience and said, "What do you mean? I'm the deputy editor of the magazine, and come write for me." And so I did. I wrote a piece criticizing Obama's post-colonial outlook, and it had a huge number of responses, and they invited me. And in the beginning, I started writing op-eds. They thought this was a nice gimmick and it draws attention and it's all fun. And so they put me like front and center on their website and stuff. And then they realized maybe this is not such a good idea. Maybe I'll convince someone. And so they started writing pieces against me. So if you go to the Haaretz website, there's a period where, I don't know, there was 1 or 2 pieces with my name in the title a week. Taub's mistake. Taub is the evil. I know they didn't say Taub is evil, but it was attempts to delegitimize my pieces. And then they figured that if you shoot at someone too much, you only make them bigger. So they started marginalizing my pieces, but they let me write them. Suddenly there was a lot of fact checking. Suddenly there were a lot of questions. But I persevered. And by the way, without pay. It was a lot of work, but I thought it was a mission to do it. They're very stingy, but they have a monopoly of this most important op-ed page, and so you're supposed to be thankful that you can write there. And when the reform came, they went full Bolshevik, and they had to completely mislead their audience about the Netanyahu government initiative for a legal reform. And so it became a propaganda sheet that's all lies about the reform. Somehow the reform is the beginning of dictatorship. It's a messianic dictatorship. It's all these evil Smotriches behind this, and all the national religious and the ultra-Orthodox and stuff. While the reform was supposed to move more power to the center and bring it back to elected officials, because Israel is ruled by a judiciary. So I supported the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza because I'm a Zionist, and because I didn't want to be. I didn't think human rights will improve in the territories. So there's no longer this argument that it would improve human rights, because there would be a Fatah rule there, and there would be no niceties about human rights. If you look at the whole Muslim world, why would it be different? But I would not be the violator of human rights. I don't want, it's their business. It's not my business, and I don't want to administer their lives or to rule over them. And so we retreated from Gaza. And this was, by the way, I was in the whole of the center in Israel supported that. There was a clear majority, and Kadima won. The Arik Sharon's party won the elections after disengagement too. Originally, Sharon ran against disengagement. Disengagement was the Labour Party platform in 2003, and Amram Mitzna, who was the head of Labour then, lost the election to Sharon. 2 years later, Sharon adopted the platform that he defeated and moved out of Gaza, and I supported that. And then he won the election only a few days before the election. He collapsed, and Ehud Olmert took his place and became prime minister. And the idea was continue disengagement. But after we moved out of Gaza, rockets kept coming. And people said, wait, why are they shooting rockets at us? We just left Gaza. Gaza can now be basically an independent state. But we still said, and I still said, well, rockets are not as big as a danger as demography. So good thing, good riddance of Gaza. And we didn't think they can do much more. And then came the Second Lebanon War. The Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah shot rockets at us, and we suddenly saw what rockets can do, because a third of a country was completely paralyzed. It was not like intermittent shootings of Qassam primitive rockets at Sderot. It was suddenly a third of the country was paralyzed. And so we started to say, we can't let that happen in Gaza. And And then came the so-called Arab Spring, and then I was done with partition. Because I started worrying what would be if it. I started thinking, until we solve this rockets problem, we can't disengage from Judea and Samaria, because if you know the map, Israel is 9 miles wide between the hills of Samaria and the beach. From Samaria, you can see where we're sitting right now in Tel Aviv. You can see the beach. It's practically overlooking the only international airport that we have. And so we can't afford that to be another Gaza. So that was put on hold, but it was completely taken off the table for me with the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring turned out to be a civilizational collapse, and the collapse of the nation state in the Arab world. So if you look at the tragedy of the Arab world, which we are living in the midst of political lava that finds no form of order whatsoever, and so it blooms to horrors like ISIS and Al Qaeda, because nation states are collapsing. So if you look at the history of the region, you would see that monarchies collapsed, then Pan-Arabism collapsed, Arab socialism collapsed, political Islam collapsed, and nation states collapsed. So no principle of political order that we know has managed to survive in this region. And I thought, you can't have territorial continuity from Tehran to Ben Gurion Airport. You just can't have them, give them access to the hills of Judea and Samaria. And so it became clear to me that there's no way that we are ceding control of the Jordan Valley and of the mountain ridge and of everything. So you might ask, what happened to my former argument about the Jewish majority, about ruling over the Palestinians without human rights, about all that? And my answer is that these dilemmas will have to be postponed, because we can't solve them at the expense of being alive. That's out of the question. And now if politicians and the Americans think that they will use October 7th in order to bring back the two-state solution, they are dreaming. This is a pie in the sky, because what Israelis have shifted strongly to the right. And according to one poll, 40% of Israelis say they moved rightward in their opinion. So if the two-state solution was off the table before, it's now completely dead. There's no any logic in talking about it at all, because we saw what little Gaza can do with this ragtag band of bandana-wearing terrorists. And the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, rejoiced in the massacre of October 7, has an army, has a real army, which was trained by the United States. And they're supposedly policemen. Why are they training in parachuting? They're not a police force. They're an army waiting for an invasion. And if you think that people who were formerly on the left, who live in Kfar Saba, 5 minutes from the territories, are going to now agree to live in the shadow of a new terror state, which is vastly larger than Gaza, then you must be dreaming. There's no such thing.
Israel would not side New Jersey in comparison to what the United States, say Gaza is inside.
I'd say a third of New Jersey, or even slightly more, something on that order. And this is located in the heart of Israel, because Israel. But I'm talking about Judea and Samaria.
But Gaza. What size is Gaza?
Gaza is maybe 5% in size of Judea and Samaria, but don't quote me on that amount. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but look at the map, and you see this tiny little strip on the beach, while the huge chunk in the middle is Judea and Samaria. Yeah, so West Bank is of the Jordan River, because many Americans are not sure what river it is between the Jordan and between the river and the sea. Yeah.
In 1967, when that territory was taken after a war, why weren't the people there stopped?
Oh, because we don't do such things.
Isn't that typical of war, that if you say ground?
We behave much more morally and with much greater care with the human rights of our enemies than any other country. If you compare, it's just that we get negative attention, which is completely skewed, because when the Western coalition led by the United States was fighting ISIS, they razed Mosul to the ground, as they did with Raqqa. And I think at least 30,000 civilians were killed. The ratio of civilians killed in IDF operation is always smaller, because we have the knock on roof procedure. We first do a little warning that we're going to bomb this area. We stopped doing this, thankfully, in this war, but we still give warnings and tell populations to evacuate certain areas. And we are by far the most moral army in the world. And as a friend of mine who's a comedian once said, we're also the only army in the competition. No one judges armies by that standard. And regrettably, a lot of our commanders, by the way, most of them educated in special programs by progressive American universities, especially Harvard, where our public servants are sent to get a degree, they pride themselves too much on how moral they are, and they're not bent enough on winning wars. And I think we will need to replace this whole generation who this was not just a failure of intelligence. This was a huge failure of intelligence that is rooted in the fact that we can't imagine that these people are different from us. We imagine them like them. And so our intelligence said that they have no interest in attacking Israel, because we supply them with employment. And so it's not in their interest, because they couldn't imagine fundamentalism or religious devotion. They couldn't imagine this. And so they were cocksure that nothing would happen, all of them, until the eve of the attack itself, because there were clear warnings, and we had the Hamas plan. We had the Hamas plan. Some people in intelligence were screaming, this is going to happen. And then, no. This is all fantasy, said our chief of national intelligence. This is silly. But this was also a huge operational failure, because once an attack started, where is the army? Why are there not sufficient forces around Gaza? And part of the answer is that these people prepared the army, the leadership of the IDF, prepared according to their assessment of the intentions of the enemy, not according to the capabilities of the enemy. No responsible army prepares on the basis of an analysis of intentions, because intentions can change. You have to calculate your readiness according to what the enemy can do, not according to what it wants to do, because it can change its mind.
And that actually brings up the question of why Hamas developed the level of capabilities that it developed. You're going to also the IDF, the Israeli government and intelligence, etc. That it seems very surprising that right next door in this tiny little area, so much military capability and training was happened, but nobody kind of responds to seeking out.
Yeah, there was no political viability before October 7th, we have to admit, for a ground incursion of Gaza. Look at how much pushback we're getting after the massacre. There seems to have been no viability to the idea that we could do it before. But the intelligence increasingly relied on very arrogant assessment of intentions, and so it also neglected human sources. And this happened to the whole IDF. For 20 years now, we've been plagued, I would say, by the idea that we will be a smart, agile, small technological army, and that we need Air Force, cyber, and electronic monitoring equipment, and we will outsmart them, and we will hide behind this slurry wall, this wall that is that also reaches I don't know 30 meters underground or even more than that, and so we were shutting down units of armored divisions, infantry, ground forces, because we'll outsmart them, and we've become cocky and also negligent, and this is Iranian modus operandi. They learned this from the increasingly sophisticated strategists of Iran and here the neighborhood Hezbollah, in which you can overwhelm high tech with low tech. So look at what they did: paragliders, motorcycles, bulldozers, low tech rockets. What they did, and they had a very clear understanding of us, which we didn't have of them. They had maps of our settlements, of our centers of population. They knew how the IDF operates. They attacked the headquarters of the divisions first, the Gaza division. They blinded our monitoring equipment, and then they shot this barrage of rockets, which confused the system, because what the Air Force first did is it went to attack targets inside Gaza. We couldn't even, we had no ready response for the way they were employing multiple layers of low-tech equipment that we just were not ready for. And they caught us completely flat-footed. But what happened is, I think, the good news is, this was not supposed to have happened. This was supposed to have happened after Iran has the bomb or is very close to it, and then in multiple theaters at one and the same time. And indeed, many people thought, I interviewed one friend of mine who's a commander in the infantry, and he's a religious guy. So when he saw these rockets coming from Gaza, he lives in Samaria, so it overlooks the beach. And he saw these rockets, he said, this is not, he opened his phone, although it was a Shabbat, and he rushed with his unit. He called everybody, and they rushed to the north, because he immediately said, if they started this probably coordinated, Hezbollah is going to start it soon too. And Hezbollah was not ready, because Hamas jumped the gun, I think, because of the normalization with Saudi Arabia, and the fact that they felt that they were being abandoned by the rest of the Arab world. And so they jumped the gun. And Hezbollah was not ready, and Iran was not ready, and a terrorist Hamas in Judea and Samaria, which is very strong, was not ready, and the Houthis were not yet ready. And so the idea to encircle us, God forbid. So this war is just chapter one of what is going to be a very long struggle.